So, Ms. Pierce and Ms. Beckstead, Mr. Hemingway, thank you for being here. We're going to welcome you to what is officially the Speaker's Task Force on Intergovernmental Affairs that we're having hearing today. This will probably be the final one. We will have to wait to see what the new speaker decides on if something like this will go forward into the future. But today's hearing is entitled Federalism Fixes Legislative Concepts to Improve Intergovernmental Relations. It continues the work of what we have been trying to do in the task force for quite some time. In fact, the goals we've always had are to provide a forum for states and cities and tribes and counties to showcase innovative and creative solutions that they have to public policy problems, to examine the effects of federal rules and regulations on state and local partners, examine the extent to which the burden sharing among states, tribes, and local governments may be reallocated to improve the quality of the life of those communities, and to develop proposals to accomplish these goals. We're excited to have the witnesses who are here today. You'll have roughly 5 minutes to make your presentations, and then I get to answer your questions. Now, I have to realize, first of all, even though we have a lot of people who are not here today, there are a lot of problems that developed this morning, none the least of which is the new majority party, which is still the minority party, is doing election stuff right now. So that most of my friends who are going to be here on the Democrat side, they're stuck somewhere else at this time. And we had a couple of changes within this morning on a couple of the members who are always here on the Republican side as well. So I apologize for that. However, I do want you to realize that what we will be doing is creating a final report for the task force with some recommendations. And they've got to be some specific recommendations. And what the three of you will be talking about today, I think are going to be really specific and important in trying to come up with what those final recommendations are. So, as we have talked about in all these other meetings, with everything Congress does and everything Washington does, there are always specific issues that could be readdressed and fixed. But what I'm looking at more than just on specific issues is how structurally we can illustrate things to solve some of those problems. The problems of the future will always change. The interface, the state and local governments and tribes that want flexibility, the issue will always change. The concept of how we make sure that that flexibility remains is the most significant thing that is there. So let me have the three of you make the statements, which once again will be recorded and for the record. And then there's some specific questions that I have, and if anyone else shows up, there are going to be others, but I know there's some specific ones I have for each of those. So if I can have first the Honorable Beth Pierce, who is speaking. You are the Treasurer for the state of Vermont. Thank you for coming down here. It's kind of strange that this may be warmer than Vermont. This may be one of the few times it actually happens, but it's still cold here too. I understand you are the current president of the National Association of Treasurers, which is wonderful. I appreciate your efforts and your willingness to speak on these types of issues on what you see as the concept and the role of federalism, specifically as relates to the financial side of situations. Then we'll have Ms. Brita Beckstead, who manages a portfolio focused on energy and air issues. You, prior to joining the Western Governors Association in 2017, you were an Assistant Attorney General with the Colorado Department of Labor, and you represented and advised the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. So we appreciate you being here talking about the issues from the state perspective. Then Mr. David Hemingway, we appreciate you being here. You're a former Executive Vice President of Zions Bank Corporation, where you spent 42 years working. You have an MBA from the David Eccles School of Business at the University of Utah. And since retiring, you developed a passion for federalism. 2016 started this push for the re-empowerment of the States Amendment. You travel the country speaking on these and significantly related issues. So I'm happy to have all three of you here. Ask you to make your opening statements, and then let's have a discussion after that. So Ms. Pierce, if you'd like to begin, thank you once again for being here.
Thank you very much, Chairman Bishop, and thank you for convening today's hearing to examine legislative concepts to improve intergovernmental relations. Last week, I had the privilege of being elected to a fifth term as Vermont State Treasurer. I also have the honor of serving as the National Association of State Treasurers President. Now The territories and the District of Columbia are also members of NAST. We are headquartered in D.C. to provide advocacy and support to enable states to pursue and administer sound financial practices and programs benefiting citizens across the nations. Intergovernmental relations is central to much of the work we do as treasurers, whether it is financing critical infrastructure projects with our states, managing our state's debt, returning unclaimed property to its rightful owners, or administrating 529 college savings or 529A ABLE savings programs. There is an important partnership with federal government. The Federal Highway Bill and other infrastructure-related authorization bills, along with the guidelines set forth by agencies such as the Department of Transportation, are critical for state and local governments. Federal tax policy is critical to debt issuance and to infrastructure financing, and the tax code has also helped form the basis for over $300 billion worth of assets under management in the college savings plans across the country. It is helping families and individuals with disabilities save money for their living expenses. Federal banking policy as set forth by Congress and the primary banking regulators is also critical to how states manage their monies through local government investment pools. Treasury regulations are critical to treasurers' unclaimed property programs and efforts to reunite Americans with billions of dollars of U.S. savings bonds. In each of the disparate policy areas, federal policy has had the opportunity to greatly enhance or detract from the work that we do in states. However, we are optimistic that Congress is listening. In the aftermath of the financial crisis of 2008, the financial banking regulators promulgated a rule that disincentivized banks to hold high-quality investment-grade municipal securities. This year, Congress acted in a bipartisan fashion to undo this damaging action, enacting legislation that required that these securities be categorized as high-quality municipal assets for banking purposes. As the task force contemplates legislative options to improve intergovernmental relations, we ask first and foremost that you provide states with the flexibility we need to invest in our projects that we have identified as most critical to our states, whether it's investments in roads and bridges, water infrastructure, state and municipal governments. We all benefit from a true partnership with the federal government. From a legislative perspective, we also ask that Congress provide maximum flexibility for states in financing these projects. To this end, we ask that Congress revisit a critical policy change that was enacted as part of the Tax Cuts and Job Act of 2017. While the legislation importantly preserved the tax-exempt status of municipal bonds and private equity bonds, it ended the opportunity for states to save money for taxpayers by refinancing existing debt known as advanced refunding. Quite simply, advanced refundings lead to more infrastructure investment at a reduced cost to the taxpayers by allowing state debt managers to take advantage of favorable interest rate conditions when appropriate. NAST strongly supports H.R. 5003, a bipartisan bill led by Representatives Randy Hultgren and Dutch Hoopersberger, which would reinstate the advanced funding bonds. In closing, we as state treasurers would like to thank the task force for the important bipartisan work you have undertaken to improve governmental relations. As your work continues, we would be honored to work with you and your staff to complete legislation in this area. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify here today, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Before we get on to you, Mr. Conley, I appreciate coming in here. He's on his way to Halifax in a couple of minutes. No, he's also got a couple of other appointments which have been thrown in at the last minute, so let me recognize him first.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I welcome my fellow New Englander. I hear that accent.
Just a bit.
And I hope you were as excited about the Red Sox as I was.
Which is something to say.
Very,
from a
very
Southerner,
satisfied.
isn't it? Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for convening the hearing today on possible legislative solutions that would improve intergovernmental relations, and I want to commend you for your leadership of this task force. In May, the task force convened a hearing on a very specific legislative proposal for the improvement of intergovernmental relations, the Restore the Partnership Act, which would establish a successor entity to the U.S. Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations. The U.S. Advisory Commission operated from September 1959 until September 1996, and during those 37 years, it was tasked with serving as both a forum for intergovernmental dialogue and a neutral analytical commission that publish reports and guidance on how to create partnerships across the different levels of government, much like the Congressional Budget Office, but for intergovernmental relations. What we heard at that hearing was a strong demand for the return of the ACIR. We also heard helpful suggestions on how to improve that commission. Together, Mr. Bishop, Mr. Chairman, and I have worked with our witnesses from the hearing and the National Academy of the Public Administration to incorporate those recommendations into a potential new bipartisan draft of the Restore the Partnership Act. The recommendations included, among other things, new mandatory reporting requirements to Congress and congressional hearings, as well as requiring agencies to respond to Commission recommendations. These reforms would help improve both congressional engagement and executive branch accountability. Echoing the conclusions of that hearing, one of our witnesses here today, the Western Governors Association, has identified the reconstitution of the ACIR as one of their legislative priorities for the purposes of improving intergovernmental relations. I agree with the WGA. There is a strong case for the reestablishment of the Commission. The Commission has a tangible impact on how the federal government interacts with communities around the country. It was a leading voice in identifying the increasing fiscal burdens placed on state and local governments, and as a result, the Commission helped develop the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act. Practically, the task of bringing back the ACIR is not a heavy lift. The underlying statute for the ACIR is still on the books. The Restore the Partnership Act would reconstitute the ACIR, but would make important reforms to the functions and duties of the original Commission that are responsive to the recommendations we heard at our hearings and made by the Advisory Council and former ACIR staffers and commissioners. Most importantly, reconstituting the ACIR would help us continue the good work, Mr. Chairman, of this task force, which we've done in examining the state of federalism in the United States and improving collaboration among intergovernmental partners. Finally, I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for joining me on a recent bipartisan request to the Government Accountability Office. Together, we asked GAO to conduct a review of the offices within the executive branch agencies tasked with managing intergovernmental affairs for their respective agencies. Our offices have received feedback from members of the Advisory Council for the task force that the performance of intergovernmental offices varies widely from agency to agency. Important to the practical application of the principles of federalism is a commitment by federal agencies to engagement and consultation with their intergovernmental partners when formulating and implementing policies and regulations that have intergovernmental implications. Intergovernmental affairs offices and executive branch agencies help carry out these vital collaborative functions. However, not all agencies are created equal in their execution of successful intergovernmental collaboration. As part of our request, we asked GAO to consider an evaluation of the Intergovernmental Affairs Office's statutory framework and authorities, written policies for outreach and engagement with their partners and relevant advocacy organizations, written policies for facilitating consultation and collaboration with their partners consistent with Executive Order 13132, use of state, tribal, or local government advisory councils, staffing and funding levels, ability to recruit and retain individuals with state, tribal, and local governmental experience, development of agency intergovernmental priorities and goals, and efforts to educate agency staff on the roles and responsibilities of intergovernmental partners. It's our hope that this work will help identify leading agencies and best practices that can be shared across the federal government, and potentially allow us to develop legislative remedies that ensure these offices have the policies, resources, and statutory framework necessary to serve their partners. The value proposition of functional intergovernmental relations is immense. The American federal system demands that these relationships must work. The U.S. Constitution does not give any one level of government absolute power or unlimited jurisdiction over public matters. Therefore, we rely on collaboration across governments to ensure the reliable administration of public services and the protection of public welfare. A federalism that works and delivers real results for our constituents is as fundamental to our system of governance as free and fair elections. Without either, confidence in our institutions will be diminished. And again, Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for the bipartisan spirit in which you've conducted this task force. It's been a pleasure working with you, and I hope we will continue to do so in the new Congress. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate you being here and doing that. Thank you. And then you may have to leave.
Please forgive me, but on our side of the aisle, we are in the midst of organizing for the next Congress, and I have to go to a meeting with the likely next speaker and majority leader. So if I snuck out, it's not for lack of interest, but I just have to be there.
Sure,
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Sure. That's what they all say. Yeah. Ms. Beckstead, thank you for being here from Colorado. You're on the east side of the mountains?
Yes.
So you get all the nice Canadian air over there.
Oh, yeah.
This is actually warmer for you then. Thank you.
Chairman Bishop and Congressman Connolly, I appreciate the opportunity to testify regarding the state-federal relationship, a central theme in the work of Western Governors Association. WGA is a bipartisan organization that represents the 19 Western governors and the governors of the 3 Pacific territories. My comments will focus on the need to improve federal agencies' consultation with states and legislative clarifications to address this critical issue. Western governors commend this task force for recognizing that a good faith partnership between states and the federal government will result in more efficient, economic, and effective policy, benefiting the governors and Congress's shared constituents. Improving state-federal communication and coordination is a goal that transcends party lines, and it is among the governor's highest priorities. This task force has conducted hearings to examine the current state of intergovernmental relationships and the history and evolution of federalism. It has also heard from governors regarding states' co-sovereign status, the importance of distinguishing states from other entities, and the need for improved state-federal communication. This hearing's examination of concrete recommendations is a natural extension of the panel's previous discussions. As the task force knows, states are co-sovereigns with the federal government, pursuant to the 10th Amendment, U.S. Supreme Court case law, federal statute, and Clinton's Executive Order 13132. For our system of dual sovereignty to function, federal officials must consult with governors as the chief elected officials of sovereignties on the development and implementation of federal law and policy. Yet there is a profound misunderstanding throughout the federal government regarding the role and legal status of states. Western governors have attempted to engage individual federal agencies in different administrations on the need for genuine consultation with states. Unfortunately, this agency-by-agency, issue-by-issue approach has not yielded structural improvements to the state-federal paradigm. It has become increasingly clear that Congress is best positioned to effect systemic change. This does not require Congress to break new ground or delve into uncertain areas. It merely requires clarification of existing law. Such legislation could first recognize that states are co-sovereigns with the federal government, distinct from any other entity or group, which is the foundation of the state-federal relationship and the need to consult with states. It could then address consultation by identifying basic elements of effective state-federal consultation, directing federal agencies to codify consultation procedures, holding federal agencies accountable for developing and implementing those procedures, and eliminating perceived barriers to consultation. I will address these each briefly in turn, and they are elaborated on in my written testimony. The governors assert that consultation requires meaningful, subsequent government-to-government communication
move it up closer to you, we can hear.
How about that?
That's great.
Thank you. What is the re-empowerment of the states amendment? I quote, "The several states may repeal in whole or in part any presidential executive order, rule, regulation, other regulatory action, or administrative ruling issued by a department, agency, or instrumentality of the United States. Such repeal shall take effect upon approval by the legislatures of 2/3 of the several states of resolutions for this purpose that particularly describe the same whole or part of the executive order, rule, regulation, or other regulatory action or administrative ruling to be repealed." So why is this amendment necessary? The federal government was created by 13 states joining together and ratifying the newly written Constitution. The framers of the Constitution were concerned that over time the federal government would usurp too much power over the states. For this reason, they included the 10th Amendment in the Bill of Rights, which reserves all powers for the states that are not delegated to the federal government. They also constructed Congress so that the Senate was controlled by the states. This was accomplished by having 2 senators from each state elected by the legislature of each state. In 1913, the 17th Amendment was ratified, which changed the election of senators from each state legislature to the voters. During the past 105 years, the power and influence of the states have been greatly reduced. In 1787, there were 3 distinct divisions of the government, which we all learned in high school. The legislative, the executive, and the judicial. During the past 231 years, Congress and the Supreme Court have allowed the executive branch to assume legislative and judicial powers in addition to executive powers. These additional powers are used regularly by the executive branch. The President uses legislative power when an executive order is issued to address a national concern as an alternative to passing legislation in Congress. The executive branch also uses legislative power when its departments and agencies issue orders, regulations, letters of guidance. The executive branch uses judicial power when its departments and agencies issue administrative rulings that impose fines on those that have violated the regulations of the department or agency. It can be reasonably argued that the world is more complex than it was in 1787. It can also be argued that the specialized knowledge required to write and enforce regulations on complex issues is best housed in a department or agency that is charged with the responsibility. For the most part, dedicated government employees have carried out these tasks responsibly. Unfortunately, there are occasions when these unelected government employees have taken great liberties when crafting regulations and guidance. It's become evident that there should be a process in place that would put a check on the use of legislative and judicial power by the executive branch of the federal government. James Madison wrote in the Federalist Papers, number 51, "If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place oblige it to control itself. A dependence on the people is no doubt the primary control on the government, but experience has taught mankind the necessity of auxiliary precautions." I think with the possible exceptions of President George Washington, we all believe that none of our presidents would qualify as angels. And for that reason, James Madison and the other founders created a system of checks and balances. These checks and balances were designed to avoid concentrating power in one body. Again, in Federalist Paper 51, James Madison explains the benefits of the compound republic of America. He explains that the federal government will be a check on the state governments, and the state governments will be a check on the federal government. Hence, a double security arises to the rights of the people. The different governments will control each other at the same time that each will be controlled by itself. Thomas Jefferson expressed a similar concern about concentrating power in one body. What has destroyed liberty and the rights of man in every government which has ever existed under the sun? The generalizing and concentrating all cares and powers into one body. Congress and the Supreme Court have the power to restrict the use of legislative and judicial power by the executive branch. It's time for Congress to safeguard the legislative power it was granted in the U.S. Constitution. I'm suggesting the adoption of the Re-Empowerment of the States Amendment. This amendment would empower the states collectively to provide a check on the use of legislative and judicial power by the executive branch. The adoption of this amendment will not reduce any power of Congress, but will encourage the President to work with Congress to pass laws rather than issue presidential executive orders and regulations. This amendment would give the states the power to act when they collectively believe that the executive branch has violated their rights as defined by the 10th Amendment. I'm asking that Congress pass the Re-Empowerment of the States Amendment and send it to the states for ratification. Thank you.
Sorry, thank you. I appreciate the testimony that you've given and that you have presented to us. That's all part of the record. Let me go through a couple of questions. Let me start with Ms. Pearson. I'll work down the row if I could. You spoke, I think, very eloquently about the need for state flexibility, and you gave us some specific issues that deal with some things that were passed in 2017. What I'd like you to do, though, is in addition to that, let's go through some of those things that I think are structural issues, because the issues will always change. I want to know how we can ensure state flexibility going through the future, especially on the financial side of things. We always talk here about strings that are attached, and there's a phrase I'll come back to later. But I think I, and as well as CRS, would like to know how would your association, State Treasurers Association, utilize studies or procedures about federal agency grants administration within a broader federalism context?
So I think that a couple of things. First, I don't think we have a specific policy in NAST or statement on this, so I'm going to speak a little bit from my role as Vermont State Treasurer and my perspective on this. But I do think that we see two types of grants, essentially. We see categorical grants that can be used for specific issues, and usually they are limited and narrow defined activities, and we see block grants that are used a little bit more. They're not limited to narrowly defined activities. That's generally the form that things take when we're taking a look at them. I think that the answer as to whether or not strings attached, it depends, to be very frank, and I'm not trying to be cavalier about that, but I think that there are certain things that are important across the states in terms of health and safety, bridge repairs and so on. For instance, I take a look every year at a report on deficient bridges. Our state went through a funding policy around how to do repairs and mitigate some of its needs there, and it's done a great job, by the way. But I think that having the same understanding and definitions across states around on those are important. That said, I think that there are too many periods of time and instances where we put too many strings on things and too many requirements and reporting requirements, and you make them a little less cost-effective in the process. A simpler, more straightforward approach, I think, is important. I was taking a look at some of my sister agencies and what they've done, and if I could, sir, I'd like to read two items that I think I very definitely support that are in Council of State Government's focus on federalism. And one is that Congress and the administration should avoid the imposition of both unfunded federal and partially funded mandates on the state. And secondly, that the federal government should ease restrictions in times of federal funding decline on the maintenance of effort grant reporting requirements and provide maximum flexibility, including the transfer of funds among related grant funding streams, to ensure that programs can be administered as effectively as possible without imposing new burdens on state budgets. I think that we need flexibility. There are times when there needs to be specific requirements related to grants, but to the extent we can have more and more flexibility, I think that that's beneficial to the states, it's beneficial to the federal government, and I think it's the most cost-effective way of delivering services.
All right, let me go through a couple, like there's 3 tranches I'd like to go into
Sure.
when we're talking about these grants. First one deals with information that's already accessible. How does the information that's already available as to grants impact you guys? Is it enough? Does there need to be more transparency? Is the information we're presently giving, is that sufficient, or is that a problem area?
So I think that more transparency is needed, and I would also say more outcome management, understanding the outcomes and being able to measure those outcomes is very important to the end. I think that states need to be able to, when they're implementing various federal initiatives or implementing and expending federal grants, need to be upfront about the outcomes and the costs associated with those outcomes. And I believe that at the federal level, we need to do the same.
Okay. So the outcomes and the costs, those are things which really could be improved then.
Yes.
Right now. The second thing is there was a phrase that was generated a couple of decades ago called creeping conditionalism, which I actually liked, which simply means that once a grant is accepted by a state, then the conditions for that grant's future use changes. And I saw that specifically when I was in the legislature in Utah, when to get Carl Perkins money, there was a new computer system when they were new and they were big and expensive and took up entire rooms that we had to buy, which we never used and didn't want, but that was the new string attached if you wanted Carl Perkins money in the future. Does that become a problem? Is creeping conditionalism, those strings that are added to it, is that a problem which compounds the cost for state governments?
Certainly, I'd add a new phrase: you can't hit a moving target. And for me, the issue is that when we apply for a grant, whatever it might be, or receive an allocation with certain conditions that apply, that we need to be consistent. There are changing times. We look at cybersecurity, for instance. We need to recognize that there are changing times and challenges, but we need to simplify and streamline the grant process and keep to the terms of the agreement.
Historically, we haven't done that. I don't know how we historically provide that going into the future. If there was like one change that you could recommend that would provide greater transparency, greater consistency, as well as flexibility for the states, what would you recommend?
Well, that's a difficult question. I think that we need to have a more streamlined grant announcement, application, and management process, number one. I think federal agencies have made some progress there using grants.gov, and I applaud that. But the subject matter and implementing activities by a grant are often separated into subject matter experts and then administrative experts or the bureaucratic process. And I think that sometimes by doing that, we lose focus on what we're really trying to do. This is a big issue. I saw a recent congressional report that said that about $728 billion in federal grants would be issued in 2018. That's $750 billion. And it requires a partnership. And I believe that there are important issues involved in terms of streamlining and making those dollars be cost effective.
Okay. So what I'm hearing you say is there are 3 areas that we need process reform.
Yes.
One that could guarantee a clear statement of what the outcomes are supposed to be, what the costs will be, not changing, and the administrative requirements would be the same.
Yes, I would say that. I'm going to, if you don't mind, get into a few weeds here. I was looking at one of the guidance. For instance, each state has a statewide cost allocation plan, otherwise called SWICAP, and it's authorized by federal regulations. And it's a way that you essentially assign costs to centralized administrative costs and apply those to federal grants. The administration burden is high. The timeliness of those negotiations takes a great deal of work, and the audit process is cumbersome. We can do better.
Is there, my assumption is there's not one standard that we use across the federal government. Are some agencies easier and better to work with than other agencies? Does it change agency by agency?
I think there are differences among agencies, and we don't do a lot of direct grants in the Treasurer's Office. I happen to be on the advisory board of a number of agencies that do. And from my end, some are better than others. When you have changes in personnel, sometimes the guidance gets a little bit muddied. And again, having some standardization and streamlining of the process and more flexibility to the states, I think, gets to the root of the issue.
All right. One last one, though. Having a good person in charge that's rational, making common sense decisions is the best thing you could do. Sometimes when we try and standardize a process to guard against an irrational person, we tie our hands together with red tape. Do you think it's still insignificant that we do need to standardize some practices and procedures to guard against the time where you have a new person coming in that just doesn't get it?
Well, I would look at it as standardization is important because you don't know, people change, administrations change, the bureaucracy in a particular department might change, the personnel might change, but you need to have standardization. But you also need to be able to allow, again, for that flexibility at the state level where they can make the best decisions. I'm in a state that is dealing with issues of water quality right now. And I actually was asked by the legislature to do a comprehensive financing and funding report on our clean water. And what I found there is that a lot of the efforts and a lot of the grants talk about very expensive wastewater treatment projects. And we've done a lot of that. But the cost, per pollution budget, let's say the cost per extraction of phosphorus in some of our lakes and rivers, is more expensive and then maybe a more cost-effective approach dealing with agricultural requirements or dealing with more passive management, riparian buffers, for instance, and things along that line. And you get more bang for your buck. But the tools that we have may not match that. And we need to be able to move dollars to those tools that are more effective. Have a process to do that and manage it by outcomes. Manage it by reporting those outcomes in a standard way and also the costs associated with them.
All right, thank you. I appreciate that very much. Ms. Beckstead, let me go through a couple of things. You mentioned President Clinton's executive order 13132 a long time ago. Does the standards that he established in that executive order of what should happen with agencies when they consult, are those standards that you think would be an effective definition of what should be consultation?
They're a good start. The problem with the executive order is that it doesn't provide a definition of consultation. It merely requires meaningful and timely input without more meat on the bones. Our definition requiring it to be through the governors or their designees would provide more specificity. The other problem with the executive order is that it doesn't have accountability mechanisms. So after the initial report to OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, regarding an agency's accountable consultation process, there's no further reporting required. There's no mechanism for states to seek administrative or judicial review if an agency doesn't comply with the executive order. So there are definitely things that could be improved with the executive order.
All right, so there has to be some kind of follow-up mechanism to make it effective. When you talk about the phrase meaningful exchange, that's extremely nebulous, obviously. But sometimes, for flexibility's sake, that's helpful. Does this process need to be established overall as like a one-size-fits-all for all agency interaction, or does it need to be done more agency by agency? Would it be more profitable if every agency had its own standard of what was meaningful in their interchange with with state governments?
What is meaningful definitely depends on the context and the agency and their mission. What legislation could do is lay out parameters for what that meaningful means, or at least requiring that it be meaningful. But yes, the agency would need to come up with specific consultation procedures according to their needs, and hopefully would develop them in consultation with states, so there would be feedback on if that met the definition of meaningful.
And I'm under the assumption the Western Governors Association has given us some definitions they would take as how to establish that meaningful process.
That's correct.
All right. As well as the follow-up accountability to it.
We've provided several specific recommendations, including increased reporting, types of remedies, and documentation that would show that agencies had consulted.
There have been past times when the federal government, in its desire to be, well, whatever its desire was, has basically gone around state government to talk to local entities. Specifically, the Department of Education several years ago came up with a program in which they would consult directly with local education districts as opposed to the state education department. What's the basic problem with that taking place?
The basic problem is that the co-sovereign status and relationship between the states and the federal government is unique to states. Local governments are political subdivisions of the states. So we assert that consultation should occur directly with states. The federal government has communication with local governments regularly, and perhaps that communication could be improved as well in potential legislation, but it shouldn't come in place of consultation with states, and states should be recognized as the single co-sovereigns under the Constitution with the federal government.
So I guess philosophically, I mean, there have been people that have suggested to us back here that states are not consulting with their local subdivisions. So just philosophically, should that be something that Congress enters into to guarantee it happens? Or philosophically, should the federal government still only deal on a state to federal government relationship and not interfere with the subdivisions that are created and controlled by the state?
The latter.
That was an easier answer than my question. All right, let me turn to Mr. Hemingway for a second. In your proposal, 2/3 of the states could then countermand an executive order or provision. Why 2/3? Well, let me give you the specific question.
Okay.
There have been some who have been critical by saying you could get the 2/3 smallest states, and it would be less than the population of the other 1/3 of the states, and therefore that's not necessarily a fair or a good way of doing it. Do you have a response to why 2/3 of the states should be
Well,
acceptable?
for that very reason is why I think 2/3 is the right answer. Is you can't use, for the very reason that you've explained, 51% or 52%. And obviously, from year to year, the percentage of the population would be 2/3 of the states would represent a different percentage of the population. Obviously, this was the main sticking point at the Constitutional Convention in 1787, and the compromise, as you well know, was that every state would get 2 senators, and there was an electoral college established, and it's 231 years later, there are still people complaining about that.
So if indeed you had to have 2/3 of the states to complain about and ask to rescind some action of the federal government.
Not a law, but an executive order or a regulation or direction from an agency.
May want to consider expanding that. But let's say that if you needed to have 2/3 to do that, you would have to have, even if they were small states, you would have to have like Hawaii and Utah and Vermont and Connecticut. You're going to have a wide disparity of areas that have to be represented in the country to accomplish that goal.
That's correct.
You're not going to be able to get 2/3 simply by one economic region, one geographical region, or even one political region. You're going to have to split across that.
Absolutely correct.
So if you're saying that you can get 2/3 of the states that say there is a problem, the assumption has to be there's a problem.
There's a problem. I think, Mr. Chairman, I think what would happen is, assuming that this amendment were the 28th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was in place today, I think it's safe to say that getting 2/3 of the states to agree on something is clearly indicative of a problem. I think what would actually happen is that there would be very few regulations or presidential executive orders that would actually make it through the process and be repealed. I think the real benefit of the amendment is that those that are writing regulations, the president who's issuing presidential executive orders, would be conscious of the fact that the states have the power to repeal this. I'd better take them into consideration at the point that the regulation or the order is being written. And I think that's where the real benefit would come, is what tends to happen is regulations tend to be written where a law could never be passed through Congress saying what the regulation says. And presidential executive orders, if you look at the history of presidential executive orders, some of the most outrageous things we've done in the country were done through presidential executive orders, such as having the Japanese Americans interred during World War II in Utah and other places. Those were all executive orders, and moving the Native Americans to reservations. Those were not laws, those were executive orders.
So what you're saying is that it would be so embarrassing to have something rescinded by the states that the federal government would exercise caution in the first place. And if Ms. Beckstead is talking about consultation, the practical application would be that that consultation would take place ahead of the order being given.
After 42 years of being a banker, my experience is that regulators are not risk takers. That if in fact the states had the power to repeal a regulation, they would write more reasonable regulations from the outset.
You know, the law right now says an executive order cannot countermand legislative intent. Shouldn't that be enough of a safeguard?
Apparently not.
That's a good enough answer for it. Then let me give you the other philosophical one. You talked very briefly about the vertical separation of powers. The concept of balance of power is a significant part of our philosophy of government, even though it's not written down in the Constitution or specifically mentioned. But we do the horizontal between the three branches of government that every kid has to learn and misapply in school. Very seldom do we talk about the vertical separation of power, which was easily just as important to the founders, which is why the 10th Amendment was there in the first place. However, there are some people that would say that the most important thing is to get something done, that separation of powers, that balance of power actually frustrates everything from taking place, that the presidency is frustrated by inaction of Congress, and therefore that to do something, to get something done, you got to try and break through some of those barriers that were put in there. So philosophically, what is more important, maintaining a separation of power or getting something done?
I think for the protection of the liberty and freedoms of the American people, the separation of power is critically important, as pointed out by Jefferson and Madison and the others of the Founding Fathers. Obviously, we have to figure out as mere human beings how to work together, and I think having proper checks and balances was the solution that James Madison and the founders came up with, and using checks and balances to get people to act responsibly, I think, is and timely would be my answer.
Okay. Time magazine made Mussolini the man of the year one time for the cover of their magazine, with the assumption he made the trains run on time. So what you're saying is there's something more important than having the trains run on time.
If we could have freedom and have them run 5 minutes late, I
Can
would accept 5 minutes late.
Can I ask you the last follow-up? Because there are people that will be critical, saying what we're doing is we're getting rid of, we're going back to a Confederate system. You're not saying that this would allow the states to tell the federal government what to doing. All you're doing is, if the states could repeal these things, it would tell the federal government not what they have to do, but to redo it and rethink it again. Could the federal government come back with the same regulation, same order again?
Well, that's actually an excellent question, I think. I think what would happen is, let's say that we get 2/3 of the states, 34 states, that repeal a particular regulation in a particular department. Since you're over natural resources, we'll pick BLM. But let's say that the states get together and repeal a particular regulation. So what are the options for that department at that point in time? I believe there are two options. They can issue a new regulation that tries to take into consideration what the concerns are of the states collectively, or they can go to Congress and have Congress pass the law to say exactly what the regulation says, if in fact Congress is of a mind to do that. So you're not giving legislative power to the states. You're basically allowing the states to put a check on the use of legislative power by unelected government workers in the executive branch, plus the President of the United States.
Ms. Bagstad, I think it's your assumption then that if consultation were to take place, maybe we wouldn't have to get to that next step of preemption?
Hopefully consultation would resolve the state's concerns. So that's the goal of the consultation process.
How long has the requirement for consultation with states been on the books?
Well, you could argue since the Constitution, but Congress has required agencies to consult with states at various instances throughout its iteration.
We've made the requirement, but we have yet to codify what it actually means to do that. What the checking the box actually has to entail.
That's correct, but we'd prefer not to call it checking the box.
All right. But that's our failure for yet actually making a definition of what it means to do that phrase. Even though it's there, we have yet to define what it actually has to happen.
That's correct. It is not defined anywhere in statute or otherwise.
And that is a legislative responsibility and something that Congress should do.
Yes.
So the codification becomes essential to it.
It does.
If this task force can do one thing, I think trying to move some kind of codification of what it means to actually keep that communication going on is significant and important. I appreciate that. For each of you, is there something I forgot to ask? Is there something I have missed here that you would like to just add, kind of like as a postscript to what you've already given me?
Oh, well, thank you, sir. I would say that I'm not a constitutional law or a historian on federalism. I'm looking at it from the dollars side, and for me, the central point is as a steward of tax dollars, and as stewards of the tax dollars at the federal level, we have a partnership, and we need to make sure that we use those dollars wisely and in a cost-effective manner. I'm going to quote quickly from a GAO summary, and basically, again, streamlining the overall process. When grant management requirements are duplicative, unnecessarily burdensome, and conflicting, agencies must direct resources toward meeting them, which can make them less cost-effective. And for me, that's the bottom line as a treasurer. There are other points that were made in that GAO study, and I'm pleased to hear that you folks are looking to do more and following up with the GAO on this. But monitoring grantee performance, improving the timeliness of grant closeouts, which is an efficiency issue, improving federal grants management, and using evidence to assess the effectiveness, and again, looking at outcomes and looking at things like social impact bonds and processes like that that will improve the effectiveness of our partnerships with not just you, but with the private sector as well. For me, it's about that stewardship to our citizens at both the national and state level, and I very much appreciate the opportunity to testify and to speak with you on these issues. Thank you, sir.
No, I thank you for being here. I'm an old government and history teacher, so I tend to think things in the abstract and.
Well, history was one of my favorite subjects, so thank you.
Yeah, well, you didn't have my class. That would have changed it. No, but what I appreciate you being here is bring the issue of federalism is not just in an abstract, but there is a dollar and cents reality for the taxpayer on the concept of federalism, and it makes a difference to how much they have to spend and how much they have to pay in taxes, based on if we can actually keep these concepts to provide flexibility as well as understanding the process so the outcomes are clear, the procedures are clear, the administrative requirements are clear.
Thank you very much
So
for that.
I appreciate you bringing that to it. Ms. Beckstead, what have I missed?
The one thing I would add is that sometimes there's the misconception that consultation will slow down federal decision-making, similar to the analogy that was provided with the train. But the governors, who also have resource constraints, are confident that, and who also want federal decision-making to be more efficient, are confident that it can actually make decision-making more efficient. So by talking to the states, they could use existing state documentation and data and expertise, which would prevent duplication and also from them creating it from scratch. In addition, they could avoid unintended consequences at the state level and address any state concerns before it got to a conflict. So the other reason why our view of consultation is very efficient forward is that it would provide a single point of contact with the governors, who could then provide a coordinated state response on behalf of the state. And we believe this will make the process very efficient. And the last thing I would add is that we hope this task force continues, and that we really appreciate all of the hard work that you have been doing on the issue of federalism.
No, I thank you that, and having that coordinated person, that point of contact, that in your mind would actually streamline the process.
That's correct.
I think there's two. For example, in my area, once again, NEPA was passed with the best of intentions to ensure that everyone had their say, but it has been hijacked to be a process now that slows everything down because of NEPA, and it allows people to litigate. Every time you take another breath, there's a chance of litigation. So if we were actually to codify what it means to consult and had that point of contact, and every agency had to have the procedures in place of how they would fulfill that procedure, is your contention then that it would not only streamline decision-making, so we don't have to wait 3 decades to make a decision well, I won't go into the detail. We have issues that we're still debating 3 decades later because no one can make a decision on what it is. But it would also minimize litigation costs, which are tremendous for each agency. I'm sorry, the Forest Service, after firefighting, it's the litigation costs that they have that drives them crazy. So it could be minimized if we were able to do that.
That's correct.
I like that. Mr. Hemingway, is there something I missed?
No, I would just conclude by saying by adopting the re-empowerment of the states amendment, it would level the playing field between the states and the federal government, particularly the departments and agencies. And I think on a level playing field, many of the issues would solve themselves if the people on both sides were viewed to be more co-equal rather than one subservient to the other, as has evolved in the last 231 years.
No, I like that concept again. Once again, the idea of solving problems faster can be done the closer you are to the people. But here's my problem. I'm at the end of my career here. You're giving me a way of making my job easier. where were you a decade ago when I needed it? I appreciate that.
You weren't chairman a decade ago.
I thank you for your being here. I thank you for coming the distances that you have to be here. I'm sorry I am the only one here. This looks more like a Senate hearing than a House hearing. But it's different than a Senate hearing because I was actually listening to you. And there will be a report. Your testimony will be part of what we're doing. And I intend to actually have our task force come up with some concrete recommendations. The stuff that you have given us today, I'm going to be part of those concrete recommendations. So I thank you for your efforts to be here. I don't think they've been in vain. I think they're very important. I do appreciate it. And this task force then will be adjourned.
Thank you.